Erin Kennedy here today with Evan Niu. We're doing Tech Teardown for Monday, February 10th. There's been a lot of talk about Sprint possibly trying to acquire its smaller rival, T-Mobile. The biggest hurdle for this potential deal has always been regulatory scrutiny. In fact, regulators are being quite vocal in public that they would oppose the deal. What's the news here?
So late last month, Justice Department officials said that any proposed transaction that would make the wireless industry consolidate from 4 players into 3 would get a very hard look. Didn't mention Sprint and T-Mobile specifically, but they did note that back in 2011, when the Justice Department blocked the T-Mobile and AT&T merger, ever since then, there's been a lot of really favorable competitive conditions in the industry taking place, which is why it's such a hard sell to say that moving from 4 to 3 would actually somehow be better for competition.
So the news is that Sprint execs are still trying to figure out how to move this forward, and apparently they're really surprised by this reaction from the regulatory agencies.
At least in public.
Yeah. Why do you think the Department of Justice is being so upfront about this?
Yeah, like you mentioned, I think this deal has always been destined to kind of really run into a lot of pushback from regulators. And I think it has low chances of succeeding because of that. But I think that, the regulators already know that the odds are kind of really against it, and so does the company. So I think that part of it is kind of like warning the companies, because if this has such a really low chance of going through, why waste everyone's time and money in really going through the official process? It's very expensive on all ends. Even not only from the agency side, but also from the companies. The companies spend tons of money on putting these deals together. A lot of times there's consolation fees and just breakup. There's all these things that, it's a lot of money. And if you already know that it's not going to go through, or has a very low chance of going through, might as well just save everyone the time and the money. And Sprint needs a really good argument if they want to try to back this up.
That's the thing, though. What is the argument? How can you argue that consolidation and less competition is good for the industry? It's hard to see that being a logical argument.
Well, so in the wireless industry, scale is really important because it's such a capital-intensive business. Then, once you have this infrastructure built, you just need to add as many customers as you can. And the angle that I think Sprint kind of would have to take here is that right now AT&T and Verizon are by easily the biggest 2 carriers. Put a lot of pressure on all the smaller companies like Sprint and T-Mobile. And they would maybe want to argue that, hey, right now there's only really 2 players. This would actually may go from 2 to 3, in part because AT&T and Verizon enjoy the vast majority of the operating profits in the domestic industry right now. But I think it's also different. Compare that to what everyone else sees as saying, oh, we're going from 4 to 3. Sprint might argue we're going from 2 to 3, which would increase. But I don't think the regulators are looking at this from an industry profitability standpoint. I think the Department of Justice is much more concerned about on the consumer level. And if you look back, T-Mobile has been very, very aggressive competitively in the past few months. Really been applying a lot of pricing pressure throughout the industry, really going after rivals in a big way, and that has certainly helped consumers. So I think it's a really tough sell. I don't think that this is going to work out.
All right. Everyone's favorite activist investor, Icahn, has been on a crusade against Apple, pushing for aggressive stock buybacks. Apple had recommended against this proposal, and it just got an influential backer.
So Institutional Shareholder Services is now backing Apple's stance, recommending that shareholders vote against Icahn. ISS agrees that Apple's been a little bit sluggish with buybacks, but has kind of really stepped up the game recently. Thinks that Icahn's proposal is kind of like micromanaging Apple's capital allocation processes, and it doesn't really need to, since Apple is, as we can see, that they're starting to be a little bit more strategic with it. And the only reason why you maybe should vote for it is just to send the message to the board that this stuff still matters. This buyback and your excess cash is still an important thing, even if it's not exactly, even Icahn's idea isn't the best idea in the world.
So in response to this, Icahn has actually posted another open letter to Apple outlining his thinking on this. What's he saying now? He's
actually throwing in the towel, more or less. He's a little bit mixed. He's disappointed that ISS is opposing, but he also doesn't entirely disagree with them. A lot of it is because of Tim Cook's disclosure last week that Apple has just bought back a ton of stock, about $14 billion in the past 2 or 3 weeks, ever since earnings, and that has really kind of changed everything. So if we look at in the fiscal first quarter, Apple bought back $5 billion. If we include the $12 billion accelerated share repurchase program they just did, they're on track to do about $32 billion this fiscal year. Icahn's proposal is for 50 this fiscal year, so it's only about 18 billion short, which is pretty close in the grand scheme of things when you're considering how much of an uphill fight Icahn's been fighting. So I think that he might have wanted more, but I think overall he's still probably pretty happy, pretty pleased.
So, and in about the last year, there's been a couple of big activist investors involved with Apple. There's David Eilhorn, obviously, and Carl Icahn. But the thing is neither of them actually got 100% of what they wanted or proposed. So what's the point? Like, why should investors care? Why does Carl Icahn blathering on about stock buybacks really matter? Is it just noise?
Well, I think Icahn and Einhorn are certainly two guys that you want on your side if you're an individual small-time investor, because I mean they're going to line up their interests with you, and they have the money and the resource to really kind of go out there and make a difference. So I mean, you're right that both of their original proposals were a little bit dramatic. So Carl Icahn started with this $150 billion number, which is enormous. Einhorn had this really convoluted preferred stock proposal, but I mean, Apple obviously prefers just simpler things, so the preferred thing was always kind of off the table. But I think the important thing is that all of these things kind of helped spark Apple into action and to really emphasize that shareholders are really not happy with all this cash you have sitting around. It's really getting to this point where it's too much, and
Well, don't you think Tim Cook's response in the last Friday when he came out in the Wall Street Journal, he said, "We bought $14 billion worth of shares back." Do you think that's part of Tim Cook responding to the criticism?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, Tim Cook doesn't do a lot of media interviews and appearances, and coming out like this is very much saying, "Hey, we're doing it." And especially for like an outlet like the Wall Street Journal, he knows he's going to get tons of coverage. He's very clear about the message that he's sending, in that Apple knows what it's doing and is going to start doing this, because I mean, shareholders were upset because it puts a drag on all these metrics like return on equity, return on assets, and eventually, I mean, the important thing is that Apple cares now, and none of this would have been impossible under Steve Jobs because he was so adverse to buying back stock for whatever reason. But Tim Cook is very open to it, and I think that it's better for shareholders in the long run.
BlackBerry's long-term turnaround might lie in software, but the company is still rumored to have a powerful new phone in the pipeline. What are we hearing about this?
So we're seeing a kind of speculative rumor that BlackBerry has an octa-core, 8-core, 64-bit phone in the works, set to launch in summer of 2015. A lot of the other specs are very powerful, RAM and all the other specifications there. But more specifically, it's supposed to have a high-end Qualcomm Snapdragon chip inside, but that doesn't really pass the sniff test to me because Qualcomm has been one of the biggest bashers of octa-core chips in general. They've talked a lot.
What's the problem with octa-core chips?
Well, they've talked a lot against Samsung's Exynos Octa, MediaTek. They've really come out and kind of downplayed this whole idea a lot. And the whole idea is that Qualcomm believes that you need better cores, not more cores. The majority of apps out there right now really only use 2 cores anyways. So adding more cores doesn't really do a lot of good. And they've put a lot of marketing together to kind of convey this and educate the consumer on why that matters. Most of it's kind of marketing. It's kind of like I think about megapixels in cameras. Like there's this megapixel race of like, oh, the more is better, but it's not actually true. But it's just like a marketing thing of like a bigger number somehow looks better. But yeah, that's why I doubt that all of this, because I don't think Qualcomm's making an 8-core chip. I think they're probably going to be, they're probably doing a 4-core chip, but using their really powerful custom cores.
Well, so let's go back to BlackBerry. It's not giving up on the consumer market then, if it's got another phone coming out.
Yeah, I don't think they are. CEO John Chen, has really kind of outlined his strategy, and there's 4 aspects of it. One of them is still to kind of focus on this consumer end of it. But I still.
Do you like that strategy?
I still doubt it because it's true that BlackBerry has a loyal base of customers. It's very small, but they're very loyal. But the real question financially is, can BlackBerry's upgrade cycle be enough in regular enough and compelling enough to get this small base of loyal users and turn that into an actual recurring revenue business on the hardware side, which I think the answer is no, especially as you talk about BlackBerry trying to transition people from BlackBerry 7 to BlackBerry 10, and BlackBerry 10 doesn't have as many data and service fees, so that's downward pressure on fees. There's a lot of really things working against them here. I don't doubt that they have a bunch of new devices in their pipeline, but I don't think it's the one we're talking about.
Are you not buying the turnaround story for BlackBerry?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Graphics specialist Nvidia reports earnings on Wednesday. What should investors be on the lookout for? So
as far as the market's expectations go, looking for about $1.05 billion in revenue, which is in line with their guidance. Adjusted earnings per share of 18 cents. The graphics segment should see a boost over the holiday quarter. I know most people don't tend to think of high-end GPUs as stocking stuffers, but there are gamers out there that do. AMD did launch some new GPUs over the holiday, so it might be some competitive pressure. I tend to watch the Tegra business a little bit more since I like the mobile space and kind of follow that closely. Tegra hit a pretty big speed bump last year and kind of want to see if they can ramp that back up in 2014.
So Nvidia announced new Tegra K1 chips last month. What do you see coming up for the Tegra business? How do you think it's doing?
So K1 was announced a month ago and starting to ship this quarter. Probably not going to be much impact on this quarter that they're about to report. Tegra 4 was launched late last year, and they, after missing out on a bunch of Tegra 3 wins, I guess the real question is, did they make up for it with some of this late Tegra 4 wins? Tegra 4i, which has the integrated modem, is also supposed to be launching in the first half of this year, so we might start to see that ramp up. Consumer devices are expected pretty soon, so I mean that's a pretty important milestone for the company strategically in its competition with Qualcomm.
In the chip space, though, do you like Nvidia?
I think they're kind of a long shot. They've been really trying really hard, and for in 2012 they had a really good story in 2012. They were winning tons of design wins, making a bunch of headlines of Tegra powering all these high-profile devices. Kind of fell back in 2013, in part because of the timing issues with Tegra 4. So it's kind of a mixed story. They still have a shot at it, but for investors, the real question is, can Tegra ever become profitable? I mean, Tegra has operated at a loss for a long time. And, it's a very new business and very intensive with R&D. So that's one thing I'm going to be watching this quarter is the newer K1 chips that come out later this year are actually going to be using custom cores, kind of adopting a Qualcomm strategy of lower number of cores but better cores. But that's extremely intense. They're putting a ton of money into that. So I want to see if the operating loss is going to be widening or not.
All right. That's all for today on Tech Teardown. For Evan Niu, I'm Erin Kennedy, and we'll see you next time.